There's something strange happening with the way we live today. Something we accept as normal, but when you stop to think about it, it's completely absurd. We wake up every day carrying an invisible question that won't leave our minds. What am I doing all this for? And this question doesn't just appear occasionally. It's there all the time, whispering softly while you drink your coffee, while you work, while you try to sleep at night. And what's most disturbing is that we've turned this question into an obligation, as if you owed the universe a clear answer, as if your entire life were a test you need to pass by, proving you understand why you're here. Albert Camus looked at this whole dynamic and noticed something most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. Maybe this question has no answer. Maybe the universe isn't waiting for you to figure anything out. And maybe the weight you feel comes precisely from insisting there should be an explanation when there simply isn't one. Modern society has done something cruel with the idea of being lost. It's turned doubt into pathology, uncertainty into a symptom of something wrong with you. Everyone around you seems to have a plan, a direction, a personal mission that justifies every choice they make. And you look at all this and think, why doesn't it work like that for me? Why do I still wake up not really knowing what I'm doing here? The inconvenient truth is that all this clarity people show is often performance. It's a nice narrative built retroactively. It's the result of taking disconnected pieces of a life and organizing them as if they'd always made sense. But we don't talk about this because admitting you're lost has become synonymous with admitting failure. We live in the age of optimization, where every second needs to be justified. Every experience needs to add value. Every choice needs to align with some greater goal. There's no more space to simply exist without clear purpose, to experiment without knowing where that will take you, to do something just because. Everything needs to be part of a personal development journey. Everything needs to be building something. Everything needs to mean something. And when you can't fit your life into this narrative of constant progress, when you look at your days and they seem like just days, without a unifying theme or clear direction, a heavy guilt arises, the guilt of wasting your existence. Camus called this the absurd, this brutal confrontation between our human need to find meaning and the complete indifference of the universe in offering us any. And the anguish born from this confrontation isn't a sign of weakness or indication that you're doing something wrong. It's simply what happens when a conscious being realizes they exist in a universe that wasn't programmed to answer your existential questions. The world isn't a puzzle waiting to be solved. It's not an enigma with a hidden solution. It just is what it is. Matter organizing itself into increasingly complex patterns without any intention behind it, without any master plan, without any reason that justifies why there's something instead of nothing. But we can't accept this, can we? We need to believe there's a why, that our existence was planned, that we're part of something bigger. Because the alternative is too terrifying to contemplate. The possibility that we're here by cosmic accident, that there's no higher force evaluating our choices, that when we die, we simply cease to exist, and everything we built eventually disappears too. So we create narratives, invent purposes, build systems of meaning, all to avoid looking directly into the void. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's completely human. It's part of how our species deals with consciousness of our own mortality. The problem starts when this creation of meaning becomes an obligation, when you become your own harshest judge, demanding explanations you simply can't give. Think about how many times you've paralyzed yourself trying to make a decision because you needed to be sure it was the right decision. As if there were a correct path written somewhere, and all others were detours, mistakes, wasted time. You stay there analyzing, weighing pros and cons, trying to predict all possible consequences, trying to guarantee your choice will make sense when you look back 10, 20 years from now. And meanwhile, life keeps passing. Opportunities go away, moments dissolve, because you're too busy trying to crack the perfect code. And there's something particularly insidious about this. The pressure doesn't just come from big choices. When you demand that everything have meaning, even the most trivial decisions become paralyzing. You're standing in front of your closet choosing clothes, and suddenly that becomes an existential question. Does this outfit represent who I really am? Does this choice reflect my values? If I wear this, am I being authentic to myself? It's absolutely exhausting to turn every small daily act into a philosophical statement. And the absurd is right there. You can make the big, the cosmic, seem small when you treat it lightly, but you can make the small seem crushing when you load it with meaning. Clothes are just clothes. Coffee is just coffee. Not everything needs to be a symbol of something greater. Making an analogy with music, it's like you're trying to compose the perfect symphony, but you're stuck on the first note because you're not sure it's the right note to start with. So you never move forward, never actually play anything. You're forever in the planning stage, in the analysis, in the search for the perfect note that never comes. And meanwhile, other musicians are playing, making mistakes, improvising, creating things that are imperfect but real. Life requires that you play without knowing if the note is right, that you make choices without guarantees, that you walk even when you're afraid you're going in the wrong direction. And there's a particularly cruel layer to this whole story. When you finally find something that seems to make sense, when you think you've discovered your purpose, this feeling lasts very little time before the doubt returns. Because the desire for absolute meaning is insatiable by nature. It always wants more depth, more certainty, more explanation. You reach an answer, and it immediately seems incomplete, superficial, insufficient. So you look for a better answer, a deeper layer, a truer meaning. It's a race where the finish line keeps moving away at the same speed you're running. Camus looked at this and saw clearly. This infinite search isn't a journey towards somewhere. It's just circular movement disguised as progress. So what do we do with this? How do we live knowing the answer we're looking for doesn't exist? Most people choose one of three paths. The first is denial. Pretend you found meaning, build a comforting narrative, and defend it tooth and nail even when cracks start to appear. The second is despair. Accept there's no meaning and collapse. Decide that if nothing matters, then nothing's worth doing. And the third, which is what Camus proposes and seems the hardest, but is the only honest one, is lucid revolt. Recognize the absurd and choose to live fully anyway. Not because you found a grandiose reason, but because you decide that living is better than not living. That creating is better than destroying. That loving is better than closing your heart. All of this without needing cosmic justification. This revolt has nothing dramatic or heroic in the traditional sense. It's not you shouting at the universe or making grandiose gestures of rebellion. It's you waking up in the morning, looking at the indifferent silence of the cosmos and deciding to make coffee anyway. It's you knowing that in the end everything turns to dust, but planting a tree anyway. It's you being aware there's no definitive answer, but asking questions anyway, because asking questions is part of what it means to be alive. It's a quiet, almost invisible form of courage. The courage to participate in life without demanding it makes sense first. And when you stop demanding meaning, something interesting happens. You start noticing small meanings that were always there but you ignored because they weren't grandiose enough. The pleasure of talking with someone you like, without needing that conversation to be building a meaningful relationship, or developing your social skills, just talking because it's good. The relief of a moment of silence where you're not producing anything or developing yourself, just existing in peace. The satisfaction of making something with your hands, creating something physical and imperfect, without any ambition for it to change the world or reveal your purpose. Now, there's something that needs to be said about the industry that's been built around all this anguish. They've discovered that existential anxiety is extremely profitable merchandise. The more lost you feel, the more you consume products that promise clarity. The more inadequate you perceive yourself, the more you invest in personal development. And the system is perfectly calibrated to never completely satisfy you, because a satisfied customer stops buying. So there's always one more level of self-knowledge to reach, always one more certification to get, always one more retreat to attend. And you keep consuming, investing, searching, without realizing you're trying to buy something that's not for sale. Peace with the absurd nature of existence. But here's what nobody tells you. What Camus proposes can't be bought or outsourced or learned in 5 simple steps. It's a fundamental shift in perspective that only happens when you stop fighting against reality and start accepting it as it is. And this acceptance isn't passive. It's not giving up. It's precisely the opposite. It's the active recognition that you have complete freedom precisely because there's no pre-written script, no purpose you need to fulfill, no cosmic evaluation of your merits. You're free to do whatever you want with your life, and this total freedom is terrifying and liberating at the same time. There's a story Camus tells about Sisyphus that summarizes all of this perfectly. Sisyphus was condemned by the gods to push a huge rock up a mountain eternally, and every time he almost reaches the top, the rock rolls back down and he needs to start over. It's the perfect image of futility, of meaningless effort, of the absurd task. And Camus looks at this and makes a statement that seems crazy at first glance. We must imagine Sisyphus happy. What do you mean happy? The man is condemned to an eternally futile task. How can he be happy? The answer is that Sisyphus finds meaning not in the result that never comes, but in the very act of pushing the rock. He accepts the absurd of his situation, recognizes the task has no greater purpose, and chooses to find satisfaction in the process anyway. And we are Sisyphus, all of us. We're all pushing our rocks, doing our daily tasks, living our lives without any guarantee that this leads somewhere meaningful. You could spend the next 50 years searching for purpose and die without ever having found it. Or you can stop searching and start living. You can find satisfaction in the things you already do. You can create small and provisional meanings that don't need to last forever or explain everything. You can push your rock knowing it will roll back and do this with some strange form of joy. Not because you're a masochist, but because you finally understood that the alternative is a form of living death. But let's talk about something the motivational discourse never mentions. Even people who genuinely found something they call a vocation have existential crises. Purpose isn't a permanent vaccine against anguish. It's more like a fragile construction that needs to be constantly maintained, reaffirmed, sometimes completely rebuilt. And there are people who dedicate their entire lives to a cause or passion and still wake up some days wondering if they're doing the right thing. This never appears in public narratives because it doesn't sell, doesn't inspire, doesn't fit the story that discovering your purpose solves all problems. And here's something crucial about these "I found my purpose" narratives. They're so seductive because they promise much more than clarity. They promise belonging to a select club of people who discovered the secret. They promise the status of someone who has everything figured out. They promise definitive relief from existential anguish. They promise you'll finally feel special, relevant, important. And that's why we keep believing, even knowing they're edited, even suspecting they're performative, because we desperately want them to be true, because the alternative, accepting that maybe nobody has total clarity, is too scary. There's also a dynamic of envy we rarely admit. It's not just passive comparison, it's active envy. When you see someone who seems to have clear purpose, who seems to know exactly what they're doing and why, you don't just feel inadequacy, you feel envy. You want what that person has. You want their certainty, their direction, their apparent peace. And this envy is particularly painful because it comes with shame. How dare you envy something as legitimate as someone having found their path? But the envy is there, corroding, comparing, creating a feeling that you're falling behind in a race that maybe doesn't even exist. Look, I know what it's like to feel like you don't fit in, like you see things others don't see, like there's a distance between you and the world around you. If this resonates, I left something in the pinned comment that might make sense to you. And the more you search for purpose, the more you move away from the present. Because the search is always oriented toward the future, always assumes the answer will appear further ahead, when you've gathered enough experience, enough self-knowledge, enough wisdom, so you live constantly projected forward, analyzing whether what you do now is taking you to this hypothetical future where everything finally makes sense. And meanwhile, the present slips through your fingers without being really lived. You're physically here, but mentally in a future that never comes. This makes me think about how formal education contributes to all this confusion. Since we were little, they taught us that every problem has a solution, that every question has an answer, that the world is fundamentally comprehensible. We spend years being trained to solve puzzles, to find patterns, to seek logic in everything. And then we arrive in adult life carrying this expectation that our existence should also work like this, that there should be a clear answer to why am I here? The same way there's a clear answer to mathematical equations. But life isn't a problem to be solved, it's an experience to be lived. Here's another difficult truth. Many people use the search for purpose as sophisticated procrastination. While you're discovering yourself, while you're seeking clarity, you have the perfect excuse not to commit to anything real. Can't choose a career because you still don't know what your purpose is. Can't commit to a relationship because you're still finding yourself. Can't make long-term plans because you're still not sure who you really are. And so the years keep passing and you remain in the same place, protected by the narrative that you're on a journey, when in reality, you're just afraid to live, to make mistakes, to choose one thing and give up all other possibilities. And there's something even more interesting. Some people become so attached to the search that being lost becomes part of their identity. They become the person who's searching, the person who's on a journey of self-knowledge, the person who's discovering their purpose. And then a secret fear arises. What if I find it? What if I have clarity? Who will I be without this search that defines so much of what I am? So unconsciously, you sabotage any possibility of arriving at an answer because you don't know who you'd be without the question. The search becomes comfortable, familiar, and the possibility of finding becomes threatening. But choosing without absolute certainty isn't failure. It's literally the only way to live. Every meaningful choice involves risk, involves renunciation, involves accepting you might be wrong and having to deal with the consequences. Camus invites us to embrace this uncertainty, to make choices knowing they don't come with guarantees, to commit to paths even without being sure they're the right paths. Because the alternative is permanent paralysis, it's unlived life, it's wasted existence waiting for clarity that doesn't come. Let's talk about pain too, because this is important. There's a widespread belief that suffering needs to teach something, that pain always carries a hidden lesson. When something bad happens, you're almost socially obligated to extract meaning from it, to transform the negative experience into personal growth, to find the silver lining. And if you can't do this, if the pain simply hurts without revealing any greater purpose, you feel guilty even for the pain. But demanding that even suffering makes sense is a brutal form of violence against yourself. Sometimes bad things happen and there's no lesson. Sometimes you suffer and the only meaning is that you're suffering. Sometimes life simply hurts without trying to teach you anything. And there are people who use the search for purpose as emotional anesthesia, as a way to avoid feeling difficult things that need to be felt. When I discover my purpose, then I'll process this trauma. When I have clarity about who I am, then I'll deal with this pain. When I understand my path, then I'll face this grief. But purpose never comes, so the emotion is never processed, and you remain stuck in a limbo, where you're always almost ready to deal with your emotional issues, but never really dealing with them. The search becomes strategic escape. This lucidity, this capacity to look directly at the absurd without blinking, isn't pessimistic as many people think. It's precisely the opposite. It's the foundation for a more honest and sustainable form of well-being. Because when you stop demanding that life justify your existence, when you renounce the need to have all the answers, a completely new internal space emerges. Space for curiosity without objective. Space to do things simply because you want to. Space to be different today from who you were yesterday without feeling you betrayed some true self you should be discovering. Space to make mistakes without catastrophizing the error. Life begins to breathe when you stop suffocating it with impossible expectations. The world doesn't change, you change. The same situations that used to anguish you because they didn't fit into any greater purpose become just situations. You continue making choices, continue living, but without the constant pressure that every moment needs to be building something grandiose. And paradoxically, when you stop chasing meaning so desperately, when you allow yourself to simply exist without constant justification, your life gains a richer, more real, more satisfying texture. There's a profound freedom in not knowing, in accepting that you don't know what you're here for, don't know if there's any greater purpose, don't know if your life matters on a cosmic scale. This acceptance isn't defeat, it's radical honesty. It's renouncing the ready-made answers they sold you, the motivational speeches that promise clarity in 3 steps. Camus teaches us that you can live well, can live fully, without knowing the end of the book, without knowing if your story has any greater meaning, without needing cosmic validation for your choices. Living one day at a time isn't a temporary strategy until you discover the greater purpose. It's perhaps the most honest way to exist, because meaning, when it exists, doesn't live in grandiose narratives that organize your entire life. It lives in these small present moments, a coffee you really savor instead of swallowing automatically, a conversation where you're genuinely present, a moment of quietness where you're not producing or developing yourself, just existing and realizing that's enough. These moments aren't preliminaries for the real life that begins when you find your purpose. These moments are the real life. And when you stop seeking universal meaning imposed from outside, space emerges for a much more interesting question. What matters to me? Not what should matter according to others, not what cultural narratives say is valuable, but what genuinely resonates with you, what makes you feel alive, what moves you. And these answers don't need to be grandiose or permanent. They can change next week. They can be completely different from what you thought mattered. They can be things nobody else finds important. And all of this is valid because you're the only person who will live your life from beginning to end. Here's something fundamental we need to differentiate. Are you trying to discover a purpose that already exists, hidden somewhere waiting to be revealed? Or are you creating meaning from scratch, building significance through your choices and actions? Because these are 2 completely different things. One presupposes there's a correct answer waiting for you. The other recognizes you're the author, not the archaeologist. And this distinction changes everything. If you're creating, you can't be wrong, because there's no right version to compare with. If you're discovering, you live with constant fear of looking in the wrong place. There's also this illusion that you need to deserve meaning, that you need to earn the right to have a meaningful life through effort or personal evolution or some heroic journey, as if the universe were testing you, waiting for you to prove your worth. But there's no judge, there's no cosmic evaluation, there's nobody taking notes on your points. There's only you, here, now, with the complete and terrifying freedom to live as you choose. This freedom can seem scary because it removes all excuses, but it's also profoundly liberating because it means you don't need permission from any higher force to start living. Living without certainties requires a specific type of courage, not the heroic courage from movies, the kind that involves great sacrifices and dramatic moments, but the quiet courage of waking up every day knowing you don't have answers and choosing to continue anyway. The courage to make coffee despite the absurd. The courage to love even knowing you'll lose. The courage to create knowing it will crumble. The courage to push the rock up the mountain knowing it will roll back. Camus celebrates this human persistence as a form of existential beauty because it reveals something extraordinary. Our capacity to find reasons to continue even when the universe gives us none. And here's what's perhaps most important. When you stop demanding that everything makes sense, you start really living. Not the planned life, optimized, aligned with some grandiose purpose, but the lived life, with all its contradictions and imperfections and moments that don't fit into any coherent narrative. Space emerges to experiment without knowing where it will lead. Space emerges to change your mind without feeling you failed. Space emerges to simply be, without constantly needing to be becoming someone better, more conscious, more directed. There's something that needs to be said about privilege too. The search for purpose, this existential anguish about the meaning of life, is largely a luxury of those who have basic needs met. When you're struggling to survive, to pay bills, to keep a roof over your head, the question, "What's the meaning of my life?" takes a back seat. The meaning is to survive. And there's a profound dignity in that, in this honesty of recognizing that sometimes living is already enough as a purpose, that you don't need to be building a legacy or fulfilling a cosmic mission. You just need to get through the day. So when we talk about all this anguish, it's important to recognize that not everyone has the privilege of anguishing over abstract existential questions. Let's talk about death more directly now. The only absolute certainty you have is that you're going to die. One day, all this ends, and when you take your own mortality seriously, when you truly internalize that your time is limited, you stop postponing life waiting for perfect clarity. Death isn't depressing in this perspective. It's liberating. It removes all illusions that you have infinite time. It forces you to make choices with the imperfect information you have now, to live with the urgency that comes from recognizing all this is temporary. And here's something many people don't realize. Death doesn't just put a deadline on your life. It puts a deadline on all the meanings you'll construct. Nothing you create will last forever. No legacy is permanent. Even people who leave a significant historical mark will eventually be forgotten. So this obsession with doing something that matters, with leaving a legacy, with being remembered, is fundamentally futile on a cosmic scale. And you can see this as depressing, or you can see it as liberating. If nothing lasts forever anyway, you're free to create small, provisional, personal meanings that only need to make sense to you while you're alive. Are we looking for purpose, or are we looking for symbolic immortality? Are we seeking meaning, or are we trying to transcend our own finitude through legacy and relevance? Because if it's the second option, the search is doomed to failure from the start. There's no way to escape mortality, not through achievements or through grandiose purpose. Everything ends. And accepting this, really accepting it, completely changes your relationship with life. You stop trying to eternalize and start simply living. This makes me think about relationships too. Many people have difficulty committing completely because they're still finding themselves, still don't have clarity about who they are. As if you needed to be complete, whole, totally resolved before you can open up to another person. But intimacy doesn't work like that. Vulnerability doesn't wait for you to be ready. Genuine connection happens precisely in the mess, in the uncertainty, in the incompleteness. And when you keep waiting to have everything figured out before allowing yourself to really love, you can spend your entire life waiting and missing all the real opportunities for connection. There's something particularly sad about seeing people throw away good relationships because they're seeking that perfect relationship that will fit perfectly with their life purpose. Or people who can't commit because they're always thinking, maybe the right person hasn't appeared yet. This optimization logic applied to human relationships is profoundly dehumanizing. People aren't products to be evaluated and traded when a better version appears. Real love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about choosing someone imperfect and building something together. And this applies to everything. It applies to careers. You don't need to find the perfect career that's your absolute vocation. You can choose something reasonable and build satisfaction within that. It applies to where to live, to hobbies, to friendships, to routines. You don't need to find perfect versions of everything. You can choose versions that are good enough and invest in them. And through that investment, they become meaningful to you. The meaning isn't in the things, it's in your relationship with the things. But the culture of optimizing everything has taught us the opposite. It's taught us there's always a better option, that we should never settle, that we should always be seeking an upgrade. And the result is that we live in a permanent state of dissatisfaction, always thinking the grass is greener on the other side, never able to appreciate what we have because we're too busy looking for something better. It's exhausting, and more importantly, it prevents you from developing the kind of depth that only comes from long-term commitment. Camus also talks about passion, not in the romantic sense, but in the sense of intensity. Living intensely doesn't require grandiose purpose. It only requires being completely present in what you're doing, whatever it is. You can wash dishes passionately if you're really there, paying attention. You can have a trivial conversation passionately if you're genuinely interested. Passion isn't in the activity, it's in your presence during the activity. And this is radical because it completely democratizes access to a meaningful life. You don't need to have an extraordinary career or a noble cause. You can have a completely ordinary life and still experience it with intensity. There's a useful mental exercise. Imagine tomorrow you discover you have 6 months to live. What changes? You probably stop worrying about finding grandiose purpose and start valuing simple things. Time with people you love, experiences that give you pleasure, moments of beauty. You stop postponing life, waiting for future clarity, and start living now. Why wait for a death sentence to do this? Why not treat each day as the limited and precious gift it is? Not in the dramatic sense of living like it's your last, but in the sense of recognizing your time is finite and it's worth using it living. Let's talk about this word, deserve. There's a deep belief that you need to deserve a good life through effort, development, searching. As if happiness were a prize you earn after passing the test. But who's giving this test? Who's deciding the criteria? Who's judging if you passed? Nobody. You invented this game where you need to prove yourself worthy of being well. But the truth is, you don't need to deserve to be here. You're here, that's all. Not because you're special, not because the universe chose you, but simply because you are. And that's enough. And when you let go of this need to deserve, when you accept that simply being alive doesn't require justification, something profound changes. You stop treating your life as a test you need to pass and start treating it as an experience to be lived. You stop constantly demanding of yourself that you be doing more, being more, having more clarity. You can simply be. Now, all this might seem like I'm telling you to accept mediocrity, but that's not it. Ambition continues to be valid if it's authentic, if it comes from within you and not from internalized external expectations. What I'm saying is, you can be ambitious without the neurotic need for that ambition to fit into some greater purpose. You can want things, pursue things, build things, simply because you want to. And you can fail at these ambitions without that meaning your entire life has no meaning. You can try something and it doesn't work out, and that's just a thing you tried that didn't work out. You can have multiple contradictory ambitions that don't form a coherent narrative, and that's okay. You can completely change direction at 40 and not feel you wasted the first 40. Because none of this needs to be part of a master plan. There's also the question of infinite self-knowledge. The more you know yourself, the more you discover you don't know yourself. The search for self-knowledge can become another endless loop. You do therapy, read books, take courses, meditate, write journals, all to know yourself better, and each layer you peel reveals another layer underneath. When does knowing yourself become an excuse not to act? When does the search for internal clarity become just another form of procrastination? Sometimes you simply need to make choices even without knowing yourself completely. Because you'll never know yourself completely. You're always changing. And there's something about silence worth mentioning. Sometimes the most honest answer to, "What's the meaning of my life?" is simply silence. Not doing anything, not seeking anything, simply being in silence with the question. It's not giving up, it's recognizing that some questions don't ask for answers, they ask for presence. They ask that you sit with them, that you let them exist without trying to solve them immediately. There's a profound value in this not doing, in this allowing existential questions to simply be there without demanding a solution. And here's something that might be difficult to hear but needs to be said. Some questions hurt us not because they're difficult, but because they're impossible. Insisting on answering, "Why do I exist?" can be a form of self-harm. It's like banging your head against a wall expecting the wall to eventually give way. But what if the wall is indestructible? What if the question is, by definition, unanswerable? Continuing to insist isn't courage. It might just be stubbornness that hurts you without taking you anywhere. The weight you carry doesn't come from lack of purpose. It comes from your insistence that you should have one. The suffering doesn't come from the silence of the universe. It comes from your resistance to that silence. The anguish doesn't come from the absence of answers. It comes from your fight against that absence. And when you stop fighting, when you let go, when you accept that maybe life is simply what it is without needing to mean something greater, the weight decreases. It doesn't completely disappear because you're still human and humans ask existential questions, but it loses that crushing quality. You're already enough. Not when you discover your purpose, not when you have total clarity, not when you finally understand why you're here, but now, exactly as you are, with all your doubts and uncertainties and confusions. The demand that you need to be more, know more, have more clarity, is violence you commit against yourself based on an invented idea that there's an ideal version of you waiting to be discovered. But what if there isn't? What if you're simply this, a person living, changing, experimenting? What if that's enough? Let me tell you something about how our specific generation deals with this. We grew up being bombarded with narratives that you can be whatever you want, do whatever you want, that possibilities are infinite. And that sounds empowering, liberating, but in practice it's paralyzing. Because if you can be anything, how do you choose to be one specific thing? How do you commit to one path, knowing you're giving up all the others? Our parents' generation had fewer options, so choices were simpler. But we have too many options, too many possibilities, and each choice carries the phantom weight of all the things you didn't choose. And here's something nobody talks about. These life stories you see are always built retroactively. Nobody lives life in a clean narrative arc. You live making choices based on the information and emotions you have in that moment, dealing with contingencies, reacting to circumstances, constantly improvising. It's only later, looking back, that you take all these apparently disconnected pieces and organize them into a narrative that makes it seem like it always made sense, like it was always purposeful, like it was always directed. But while you're living it, it's pure mess. And that's the real experience most people have, but nobody shows. Think also about how the idea of productivity has contaminated everything. There's no more space to simply be, to exist, without producing value or developing yourself. Even your leisure moments need to be optimized. You don't relax, you practice self-care. You don't waste time, you invest in hobbies that develop skills. You don't rest, you recharge your batteries to be more productive later. Everything needs to have a return, everything needs to add up, and when you finally have a free moment, a Sunday without obligations, instead of enjoying it, you feel anxiety because you're not being productive, you're not advancing toward anything. This logic is absolutely insane when you stop to think about it. You've turned your own existence into a constant optimization project, where the goal is always to reach some future improved version of yourself, and while you don't arrive, you're in a state of permanent inadequacy. It's never time to relax, because there's always one more step to take, and the present, this moment that's the only thing you actually have, becomes just a means to reach a future that when it arrives also doesn't satisfy because you're already chasing the next goal. Camus would look at this and see the absurd perfectly. You're running on a treadmill you turned on yourself, chasing a version of you that keeps moving at the same speed you're running, so you never reach, never arrive, can never stop and say, done. Because the point isn't to arrive, the system was designed to keep you eternally seeking. And you collaborate with this, because the alternative, stopping running and accepting that maybe you're already enough exactly as you are, is terrifying. Because if you're already enough, then you have no more excuse not to live, not to risk, not to really commit. There's a specific fear many people carry but don't admit. The fear that if you stop seeking purpose, if you accept that maybe life has no greater meaning, you'll become an empty person, without direction, without motivation to do anything. As if the search for meaning were the only thing keeping you functional. But the experience of those who actually make peace with the absurd is precisely the opposite. You don't lose motivation, you gain freedom. Because now you're no longer doing things because you think you should. You do them because you want to, because it gives you pleasure, because it interests you, and that's much more sustainable motivation. And freedom is scary. It's easier to live following a script. even if you're not sure it's the right script, than to accept there's no script, and you need to improvise everything. It's more comfortable to believe there's a purpose waiting to be discovered than to accept you need to create your own provisional meanings. It's less anguishing to chase future clarity than to deal with the ambiguity of the present. So we cling to the search not because it takes us somewhere, but because it protects us from having to face the total and scary freedom of existing without a manual. There's also something about the specific terror of being forgotten. It's not just about not having purpose. It's about not leaving a mark, about dying and disappearing completely as if you'd never existed. And this connects with the search for purpose, because we believe that if we find something grandiose enough, if we do something significant enough, we'll transcend death through memory. But even that is illusion. Even the most famous people in history will eventually be forgotten when humanity ceases to exist. So this race for relevance, for importance, for being remembered, is futile on a cosmic scale. And you can see this as depressing, or you can see it as liberating. If you're going to be forgotten anyway, you're free to live without the pressure of building a legacy. Let's also talk about this tyranny of unrealized potential. How many times have you heard that you're wasting your potential? How many times have you felt you could be more, do more, achieve more? This idea that you have a specific potential that needs to be realized is another form of pressure, because it presupposes there's a better version of you that you're failing to become. But what if there isn't a better version? What if you're just this that you are now, with your limitations and imperfections, and that's okay? The demand of unrealized potential prevents you from appreciating who you already are while you chase who you think you should be. And there are people who spend their entire lives accumulating credentials, taking courses, gathering knowledge, all in preparation for the day they'll finally start doing something real. But that day never comes, because it always seems like you need more preparation. There's always one more skill to develop, one more course to take, one more level of self-knowledge to reach. And meanwhile, life passes, and you continue preparing to live instead of living. When does preparation become the entire life? When do you recognize you'll never be completely ready and you need to start anyway? This reminds me of how we treat trial and error. We're so afraid of making mistakes, of choosing wrong, of investing time in something that won't work out, that we end up not trying anything. We prefer the paralysis of indecision to the risk of error. But error isn't moral failure. Error is information. It's the only way to discover what works and what doesn't work for you. And when you demand clear purpose before acting, when you need to be sure you're on the right path before taking the first step, you completely eliminate the possibility of learning by doing. You remain stuck in infinite analysis while you could be experimenting, making mistakes, adjusting, discovering. There's also this question of collective purpose versus individual purpose. The modern obsession with finding your unique and personal purpose is very individualistic. But what if meaning is less about discovering your individual mission and more about being part of something bigger than you, about contributing to a community, about belonging to a group, about working for a collective cause? Maybe the solitary search for personal purpose is itself part of the problem. Maybe we're so focused on finding ourselves that we forgot we're social animals who find meaning in connection, not in isolation. And when you look at more collectivist societies, at cultures where individual identity is less emphasized, you see less of this existential anguish about personal purpose. Not because people in these cultures have more clarity, but because the question is formulated differently. It's not, what's my purpose? But how can I contribute to the common good? And that takes away enormous pressure, because you don't need to discover some unique vocation that only you can fulfill. You just need to be useful where you are, with what you have, for those around you. It's more humble, less grandiose, but perhaps more sustainable. Here's something crucial too. We need to differentiate existential void from clinical depression, because these are different territories that sometimes overlap, but require different approaches. Existential void is a philosophical question. It's about meaning and purpose and the nature of existence. Clinical depression is a medical condition that can manifest as lack of meaning but has neurobiological roots and needs professional treatment. And it's important to know the difference because accepting the absurd Camus style can be liberating for someone with existential anguish, but it doesn't treat depression. If you can't get out of bed, if nothing gives you pleasure for months, if you're having thoughts about not wanting to be here anymore, this isn't just a philosophical question. It's time to seek professional help. Let's talk about the specific moment when you stop seeking. What's that like experientially? Not philosophically, but in the body, in real life. For some people, it's a dramatic moment of insight, like an epiphany, where everything clicks and you let go. For others, it's a gradual process, like you're letting go little by little, and one day you realize you're no longer fighting so hard. For others still, it's a conscious decision. Enough, I decide to stop looking and start living. And what you feel afterward varies too. Some people feel immense relief, like dropping a weight they'd carried for years. Others feel temporary emptiness because they were so identified with the search they don't know who they are without it. Others feel fear because now there's no more excuse not to really live. But eventually, if you don't fill this space with a new obsession, a lightness emerges, a strange freedom of simply existing without constantly needing to justify yourself. And there's something about how we treat should. How many times a day do you think, I should be doing X, or I should be Y? Every time you use should, you're judging yourself against an external standard you've internalized. Should, according to whom? Should based on what? When you start questioning these shoulds, when you ask where they come from, and if you really agree with them, you discover many don't make any sense for you specifically. They're just things you absorbed from the environment. And letting go of these shoulds, letting go of these imaginary obligations, is another step toward living more authentically. This makes me think about the difference between living for others and living for yourself. Not in the selfish sense, but in the sense of who's the audience for your choices? Are you living your life, or are you performing a life for an imaginary audience? Because many people make choices based on how they'll look to others, instead of based on what they genuinely want. They choose careers that impress, relationships that look good, hobbies that sound interesting, all for external consumption. And then they live decades in a life that looks good from outside, but doesn't resonate with anything internal. And when you finally ask, but what do I want? You discover you don't even know how to answer, because you spent so much time trying to be what others expected that you lost contact with your own desires. And there are people who discover this late in life, at 50, 60 years old, and feel they wasted decades living for others' approval. But even this late discovery isn't waste if it leads you to live more authentically from there on. It's never too late to start living for yourself. It's never too late to question the shoulds and make choices based on what's true for you, instead of what seems right to others. And yes, this might disappoint people, might confuse people who knew you one way and now you're changing. But the alternative is continuing to live someone else's life until you die. Here's something about resilience too. When you stop demanding that everything makes sense, you become more resilient to difficulties, because you don't need every obstacle to be a lesson, don't need every failure to be growth, don't need every pain to be transformative. Sometimes a bad thing simply happens and you deal with it and move on, without needing to extract profound meaning. And that's liberating, because it removes a layer of pressure. You don't need to transform your suffering into something beautiful or educational. You just need to get through it. And on the other side, you continue being you. Maybe a bit more tired, but not necessarily wiser or more evolved. Just someone who went through a difficult thing and survived. And let's talk about comparison again, but from a different angle. It's not just that you compare your circumstances with others. You compare your internal experience with their external appearance. You feel all your confusion, all your doubt, all your internal mess, and compare that with the polished facade others show. It's impossible for you to come out winning from this comparison because you're comparing totality with chosen fragment. If you could see everyone's internal confusion, you'd discover most people are as lost as you. Just some hide it better. Some perform certainty when inside they're full of doubt. And when you understand this, when you realize the clarity you envy probably isn't as solid as it seems, it becomes easier to stop feeling inadequate. Look, I'm not saying this to make you comfortable with inaction or to give you an excuse to do nothing. I'm saying this to wake you up to a possibility you might never have considered. The possibility that you don't need to solve the mystery of your existence to live well. The possibility that the small reasons, the provisional meanings, the simple moments of satisfaction are already reason enough. The possibility that you can make peace with not knowing and discover there's enormous lightness in that surrender. Not defeatist surrender, but conscious, active, lucid surrender. Nothing in this life is more dangerous than having absolute certainty. Certainty closes doors, limits possibilities, turns you into someone rigid who can't adapt when reality doesn't fit the script. Doubt, on the other hand, keeps you flexible, curious, open. Keeps you alive in a way certainty never can. And maybe the greatest irony is that the desperate search for purpose, for clarity, for certainty about the meaning of life is precisely what prevents you from living fully. It's only when you let go of this search, when you accept there might not be an answer, that you finally become free to experience life as it is. Be profoundly grateful for not understanding everything, for still having doubts, for still asking honest questions instead of accepting ready-made answers that don't satisfy, because that means you're alive, present, paying attention. It means you haven't surrendered to the comfortable illusion that you have everything figured out. It means you're willing to live in uncertainty, which requires infinitely more courage than living in the false security of absolute answers. What helps me most is remembering there's no path without pain, but you choose which pain to carry. You can carry the pain of demanding definitive meaning and constantly frustrating yourself with its absence, or you can carry the pain of accepting the absurd and living anyway. Both hurt, but one paralyzes you, traps you in infinite cycles of search and disappointment. The other frees you, allows you to make choices, allows you to live. Make your choices consciously. Remember that every moment you spend torturing yourself for not having total clarity is a moment you're not living the imperfect but real life that already exists here, available, waiting for you. If this video made you think differently about the pressure you put on yourself, about this demand that everything needs to make sense, leave in the comments what impacted you most. What part resonated most with you? And subscribe to the channel because we're going to continue exploring these questions everyone feels, but few people stop to really examine. Leave a like too if this helped you in some way, because it shows me it's worth continuing to make this type of content. See you in the next one.